The disaster of Khamar-Daban, how 6 Russian hikers dropped dead without cause. In August of 1993, 7 seasoned hikers embarked on what should have been an exhilarating adventure through the rugged Khamar-Daban mountains in Siberia. Among them was their guide, 41-year-old Lyudmila Korovina, a survival expert and experienced mountaineering instructor. With her leadership, the group was well prepared for the challenges of the wilderness, or so they thought. But as the team began their descent, their journey turned into a nightmare no one could have predicted. It started with one hiker suddenly collapsing, convulsing violently as blood poured from their eyes, ears, and mouth. Panic set in as the others tried to help, only to witness more members of their group meeting the same inexplicable fate. By the end, 6 hikers lay dead on the unforgiving mountainside, leaving just one survivor to tell the horrifying tale. The question remains, what happened on that mountain? A toxic gas leak? A freak weather event? Or something far more sinister? Let's dive into the chilling details of the Khamar-Daban disaster, a case that remains shrouded in mystery to this day. The Khamar-Daban Mountains. The Khamar-Daban Mountains in southern Siberia, near the shores of Lake Baikal, were the backdrop for this tragic expedition. Leading the hike was 41-year-old Lyudmila Korovina, a tough and experienced survival instructor. She was known for pushing her students hard, but they trusted her completely. The group consisted of 6 of her students. 23-year-old Alexander, Sasha, Kren was her closest companion on this trip, almost like a son to her. Tatiana Filipenko, the oldest at 24, was dependable, while 19-year-old Denis Shatkin brought enthusiasm. The youngest hikers, 16-year-old Victoria Zasova and 15-year-old Timur Babanov, were eager to prove themselves. 17-year-old Valentina Valyuyeno had a reputation for being tough and level-headed. The group was well prepared, packing carefully and planning their route step by step. Their hike started in Murino, a village near Lake Baikal. They followed the Lutai River through thick forests and steep trails, aiming to reach the mountain ridge by August 5th. There, they planned to meet Lyudmila's daughter Natalia and her group before descending together to the town of Slyudyanka for a well-deserved rest. On paper, everything looked set for a challenging but rewarding trek. But the reality would be far from what they expected. Despite their preparation and Lyudmila's experience, the mountain held dangers they could never have imagined. A promising start takes an unexpected turn. The group set out on August 2, 1993, under perfect skies. By the end of the first day, they were ahead of schedule and making great progress. But as they climbed higher on August 4, things took a turn. The trail grew steeper, the air thinner, and exhaustion began to creep in. Then the weather turned. A sudden storm rolled in, catching them completely off guard. Heavy rain pounded down, soaking them to the bone, and fierce winds roared through the trees. The trail became slick and dangerous as visibility vanished in the mist and rain. Lyudmila decided to stop and set up camp for the night. It was their only option. They tried to light a fire, but the storm was relentless. Everything was soaked, and they huddled in their tents, shivering in wet clothes and damp sleeping bags. The night offered little rest. By morning, the storm had passed, but the damage was done. Their gear was wet, and they were cold, tired, and uneasy. They were just a day away from the ridge where they'd meet Natalia's group, but something felt wrong. The usual peace of the mountains had been replaced by an eerie stillness. As they packed up and started their descent, the mood had shifted completely. The excitement from earlier in the hike was gone, replaced by a nervous energy none of them could shake. Something was off, though they couldn't say what. And then, the strange events began. The horror unfolds, sudden deaths. The group packed up their soaked tents, strapped on their gear, and began the trek down the mountain. They had barely been walking for 15 minutes when Sasha, who had been trailing at the back, suddenly gave out a blood-curdling scream. But this wasn't a cry of pain or surprise, it was raw, unfiltered terror. Everyone froze and turned to see him clutching his head, his face contorted in agony. Lyudmila quickly rushed to his side, the others following close behind, and trying to figure out if their eyes were deceiving them, but Sasha soon collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing violently. Foam spilled from his mouth, and blood gushed from his nose and ears. His eyes darted frantically, filled with panic, but within moments, he went completely still. Sasha was dead. Lyudmila knelt beside him, shaking his lifeless body, calling his name, desperate to bring him back. Then, without warning, she screamed too. She suddenly clutched her chest, she gasped for air as blood began to drip from her nose and ears. Her body seized in violent convulsions, and in a grim twist of fate, she collapsed onto Sasha, her own student. Tatiana was next. She rushed to help but suddenly clutched at her throat, as if an invisible hand was choking her. Staggering back, she crawled to a nearby rock and, in a horrifying moment of desperation, began slamming her head against it repeatedly until her body went limp. The remaining members of the group were in full panic. Victoria and Timur, the youngest, bolted down the mountain. But whatever was killing their friends had already taken hold of them. They vomited blood, clawed at their throats, and tore at their clothes as convulsions racked their bodies. Neither made it far before collapsing lifeless on the trail. That left Valia and Dennis. Terrified, they tried to flee together, but Dennis seemed to have been gripped by whatever it was killing them as he faltered. His body began to shake violently, blood pouring from his nose, ears, and mouth before he collapsed, eyes wide with terror. Dennis was gone. Now completely alone, Valia did what her survival instincts told her. She ran. She didn't know where she was going, she just had to keep moving. For 4 days, she survived on scraps of food from her pack and water from streams, expecting every moment to be her last. But, somehow, she didn't meet the same fate as the others. On August 9th, Valia stumbled out of the forest, weak, filthy, and in shock. She had survived, but she was haunted. Valia becomes the lone survivor. Valia emerged from the forest, weak, filthy, and utterly dazed. She stood silently at the edge of a river, barely noticing the Ukrainian kayakers paddling in the water. From across the river, they spotted her, a frail, ghostly figure in tattered clothes, her pale face streaked with dried blood. At first, they might have thought she was a vision or a trick of the light. When they called out to her, Valia didn't respond. She just stood there, staring blankly, lost in her trauma. It wasn't until the kayakers paddled over, wrapped her in blankets, and began speaking softly that she started to come back to reality. They asked her what had happened, but she couldn't answer. Words failed her. She simply shook her head, overwhelmed and unable to make sense of the nightmare she had survived. They took her to the nearest town, where authorities were quickly alerted. Valia, still in shock and utterly drained, couldn't speak at first. It took days before she could finally recount the events on the mountain, and even then, her story sounded too horrific to believe. 6 healthy, vibrant people had died suddenly, within moments of each other, and no one could explain why. As soon as officials realized the gravity of the situation, a search operation was launched to recover the bodies. Helicopters scoured the rugged terrain, but it took nearly 2 weeks to pinpoint the exact spot where the tragedy had unfolded. What they found was chilling. The bodies of the 6 hikers were scattered across the mountain, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. Some had ripped their clothes apart, as though trying to escape an unseen torment. Even more disturbingly, a few were missing their eyes, adding a sinister layer to the mystery. And yet, despite the gruesome discoveries, there were no clear answers, only questions. Valia's survival and the condition of the bodies raised more mysteries than they solved. What could have killed her friends so suddenly and violently? What followed were theories, wild, unsettling, and as baffling as the tragedy itself. To this day, the truth remains elusive, and the mountain keeps its secrets buried in silence. Theories and mysteries. After the search teams recovered the bodies, it took weeks to bring them down the mountain. When the autopsies were finally conducted, the official cause of death for most of the group was listed as hypothermia. It's a known danger in extreme cold, where your body temperature drops so low that your organs begin to shut down. In some cases, hypothermia triggers a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, where victims tear off their clothes because the cold tricks their body into feeling like it's burning up. At first glance, this explanation seemed plausible, especially given that some of the hikers were found partially undressed. But hypothermia alone couldn't explain everything. It didn't account for the blood pouring from their noses and ears, the violent convulsions, or the sheer terror frozen on their faces. And it certainly didn't explain why Volya, who faced the same conditions as her friends, survived without so much as a scratch. Naturally, the lack of concrete answers led to speculation, and over time, several theories emerged, some grounded in science, others bordering on the bizarre. The military experiment theory. One of the most prominent ideas was that the hikers had unknowingly stumbled into the middle of a secret military experiment. This theory suggested that the group had entered a testing zone for chemical or nerve agents, possibly something as deadly as Novichok, a known nerve agent developed in Russia. Exposure to such chemicals could explain the bleeding, convulsions, and sudden deaths. Given the secrecy surrounding Soviet-era military projects, the idea isn't entirely far-fetched. Toxic foraging or contaminated water. Another theory pointed to poisoning. Lyudmila, an experienced forager, often taught her students how to gather food from the wild. Some speculated that the group might have consumed toxic mushrooms or other poisonous plants, triggering seizures and death. However, while certain mushrooms can cause hallucinations and physical distress, their effects typically take longer to manifest than what Volya described. There was also the possibility of contaminated water. Nearby Lake Ball, though picturesque, has long been rumored to contain industrial waste. Some suggested the hikers might have drunk tainted water, leading to mass poisoning. But toxicology reports on the bodies were inconclusive, leaving this theory without solid evidence. Infrasound. A more unusual idea involves infrasound, low-frequency sound waves that humans can't hear but might still affect. Under rare atmospheric conditions, infrasound could potentially cause panic, hallucinations, or even physical symptoms like headaches and nausea. Proponents of this theory argue that an infrasound event in the mountains could have driven the hikers into a frenzied state, ultimately leading to their deaths. Volya's story and the questions it raised. As the only survivor, Volya's account of the tragedy became the key to understanding what had happened. However, over time, her story has been met with skepticism. Trauma can distort memory, and some questioned whether her account, full of vivid, horrifying details, might have been unintentionally exaggerated or misremembered. Official autopsies cited hypothermia as the primary cause of death, but this conclusion didn't align with Volya's description of sudden convulsions, foaming at the mouth, and bleeding. In a rare 2018 interview, Volya stood by her version of events, dismissing claims that the group was unprepared. She proposed pulmonary edema, a sudden fluid buildup in the lungs, as a possible explanation, but this theory didn't satisfy everyone. Unanswered questions. Years later, this case still remains an unsolved mystery. Was it a freak natural disaster? A military experiment gone wrong? Toxic exposure? Or something stranger, beyond our understanding? No clear answers yet. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unexplained, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another mystery. And let us know in the comments, what's your theory? We'd love to hear what you think really happened that day on the mountain.